Okay, part 8 of chopping at the root of a problem instead of hacking at the branches. MIT professor of linguistics, Dr. Noam Chomsky, has been explaining how the very wealthy, the top 1/10 of the 1% of the world, ardently, even aggressively, seek to govern and control what are called the vile masses. That would be us. Unless there's the top 1%, 1/10 of 1% of the world watching the program tonight. And they do this through a number of manipulations and means. We have covered the first 3 of these manipulations or principles, and then we have applied them to brick and mortar religion. We've said Chomsky talks about big government and multimedia corporations and stuff. Secularism, we don't care about that. That's his deal and other people's deal, politicians. We're talking about the principles he talks about and applying them to religion. So the first 3 manipulations in the world, and what I believe is also found in the churches, coming down from dark powers, are first, reduce democracy. That was the first principle he shared. And we applied this to the masters of religion of the faith to reduce participation of the masses in the faith down to the few who stand over the masses and keep them as spectators in the faith. That is to reduce democracy. That's one of the things. The next thing is to shape ideology. And again, we applied this to organized religion, and we're going to speak more about how they're shaping ideology as we go along. And then last week, we talked about how after you've shaped ideology, you redesign the economy. And we talked about how in the secular world, that meant that the U.S. went from manufacturing to a focus on finance, and how we stopped producing products and we started just to manipulate things to make money through financial trickery and manipulation, and that was allowed to happen through what we call deregulation of the financial institutions, where banks could now become investments, et cetera, et cetera. And then we talked about the application to the church, which was, listen, the church would love to deregulate religion, and the church would love to become the one-stop shop for everybody's everything. Go to church and we'll have an amusement park in the back. Come on in and have a coffee from the coffee shop. Go on to the bookstore and get that. We will solve your every need so you never have to engage with the world. Why? So that the one or few could have domination over the many. That's the goal. So tonight, let's go to the 4th principle, which Chomsky points out says it's a shifting now of the burden. There's a burden out there of how to take care of everybody and how to take care of everything. There has to be a shift, all right? And of course, we will talk about this first from the secular perspective, what Chomsky says and how it applies in his opinion. Now, understand, I don't support him in all his secular assessments, and I don't really care, and I don't think he's right on everything, and I know he's very liberal in many ways, but I do think he has some astute insights into what's historically gone on in our economy, and I think those astute assessments are very applicable to brick and mortar religion today. So he says the American dream, like many ideals, was partly symbolic, but partly very, very real. As an example, he says in the 1950s and 60s, there was a significant economic growth in the United States. It was the golden age of economic history. And it was pretty, he says the word egalitarian. We learned a few weeks ago, egalitarian means it was pretty fair. It was pretty equal among all socioeconomic, psychographic types. It was very fair. It was equally based. To prove this, during those glory days of economic history, he says the lower fifth of the population was increasing as much as the upper fifth of the population. That's an egalitarian rise in the standard of living for everybody, 1950s and 60s. And he adds that during this time, when the U.S. was primarily a manufacturing center producing goods, it was concerned with its own consumers. So the corporations were producing goods and they were concerned for their consumers, right? That makes sense. If the country focuses on manufacturing products, the country wants to make sure its citizens can afford to buy the products it produces. So it has a market. Not only because it increases their profits, but manufacturers, for instance, like automakers, want their employees to be able to buy the thing that they're producing. They want their employees to be able to own a car so they can drive home, so they can own a car and go to work and earn money, etc. Chomsky points out that Henry Ford historically raised the salary of his workers so they would be able to buy his cars. Now that makes some economic sense when you're raising them up so that they can be participants in the very thing you're trying to do, sell cars. But today, he suggests, we are moving to what's called an international plutonomy. It's a new word, a plutonomy for many of us. What's an international plutonomy? It's when a small percentage of the world's population internationally is gathering increasing wealth. I mean, and it is happening where there is a very small segment of society who owns 80%, 90% of the world's wealth. That's a frightening picture. In other words, Chomsky notes that what happens in the presence of an international plutonomy is that American consumers become far less of a concern to the top brass. Why? Because those top brass know that the typical American consumer cannot and will not ever buy their financial products that they use to manipulate and make money. GE, who makes most of its money now, not selling light bulbs, but selling financial instruments, knows that Joe Citizen isn't going to be participating in this. So they don't care about the common Joe Citizen. Why? They care about profits for the next quarter. Even if those profits are the result of financial manipulations, they care about their own high salaries. Just look at Enron. Look at everything that's happened in corporate America, and what he's saying is true. The top have only cared about their own pocketbooks. They have not cared about what happens with the masses. And then they also care about their high bonuses. I would add to Chomsky's list of three, they also have access to benefits that are not accessible to the common man. Those benefits packages are insane. Golden handcuffs and everything else. Where Common Joe, man, he's just left to really struggle for himself. Since these goals of the top only affect the top, the plutocrats, what happens to the rest of the world? Well, there's a term that has been created and come about, and Chomsky uses it, and he calls them the precariat. And it's a compound word derived from precarious proletariat. From a precarious proletariat. So you have the plutocracy, and then you have a bunch of precarious proletariats. These are the millions of working people of the world, the proletariat, the working class, who live increasingly precarious lives. Increasingly due to the conditions heaped upon them by the plutocracy, and who want to control everything. Look around, you'll see its effects all around. And if you don't see it, it's probably because you haven't looked and you aren't aware of it. Take a look. In a sense, I'm a precariat because of the lifestyle I choose to live. I could be a stockbroker and go back and make more money, but I choose to live kind of a precariat lifestyle, precariously proletariat. But my oldest daughter, she and her husband, utter precariat. It is not just month to month. There's not much hope for much else. They have what they have. Maybe if he stays at his job with this one corporation, he can move up, but with two boys and stuff, I mean, it's a very precarious situation. All right? So constant work just to barely make ends meet while the corporations line their pockets with profits. So how have the plutocrats manipulated things so that they can benefit so greatly up at the top while the masses are in a state of precariatism, if that's such a word? Chomsky says that what they did was they first shifted the burden. That brings us to our fourth principle. There was a shift of the burden from the producing corporations and others to the masses. And they did this beginning with taxes. They shifted the tax burden. During the period of the great growth of the economy, 50s and 60s, taxes on the wealthy were much higher than they are today. The extreme wealthy today, they hardly pay taxes, all right? Corporate taxes were existent. The best corporations, the biggest, Apple, GE, Google, they don't pay corporate taxes. They don't pay any taxes. Did you know that? So when you have the corporations and the power guys with all the money not paying taxes, who are bringing in billions and billions and trillions of dollars, and Joe Citizen has to pay 30% tax bracket, you know that there has been a shift of the burden, right? It wasn't always that way. Taxes on dividends. Dividends are something the rich participate in because they have stock portfolios and in bonds and investments, and so they get dividends and they have to pay taxes on. Well, the poor, the taxes on dividends have been eliminated. So there's no tax. The poor don't have dividends, so there's no application there. And simply put, taxes on the wealthy have been greatly reduced. But the tax system under plutocrat power and sway was redesigned so that the taxes were once paid by the wealthy corporations are now passed on, and that's shifting the burden. But there's a pretext to this, and a pretext means there is a justification for this by the top 1%. They say, the plutocrats say, this tax stuff increases investments and we are increasing jobs. That's the pretext to the whole argument. But Chomsky replies, quote, there's no evidence for that. He says, if you want to increase investment in the economy, pass the proceeds on to the poor and the working people. They have to keep alive, so they spend their income. That stimulates investment and leads to job growth, and so on and so on. He continues, but if you're an ideologist for the masters, the top 1%, you have a very, very different objective. And then he notes, in fact, right now, it's almost absurd that the corporations have money falling out of their pockets, and says GE, for example, is paying zero taxes with enormous profits. And GE, I just use them as an example, they're not alone, right? Therefore, finally, he says, the major American corporations have shifted the burden of sustaining the society through the taxes they should pay by putting it upon the rest of the population. Got that picture in mind? Fourth principle. So now let's talk about how it works regard to brick and mortar religion. That same idea. This modern church that was started by Jesus, who had no place to rest his head, who lived off the proceeds from whatever they gathered. We don't even know how, it doesn't say. I mean, he could cause a fish to get a gold piece in his mouth to pay things, I guess. The apostles, they roamed about. They didn't have places, they didn't have palaces, and they weren't out trying to gather it. We don't ever read of them holding a fundraiser. We don't ever read of the apostles trying to raise money. We don't ever read of it. Why? Because that is not what it's about. I want to talk about, are there parallels to this concept? I'm going to give you two quick stories. Here in Utah, not long ago, there was a pastor in his church was collecting funds for the poor, under the auspices of For the Poor. A friend of mine and his wife wanted to help that, and they really felt led. So they gave $2,000, which was a lot of money to most people, and was really a lot of money to them. And in the end, it was announced that the goal was short of about $1,800 for the goal for the poor. But in the meanwhile, my friend learned that the pastor and his family were awarded $2,000 to go on a Disney vacation because he had to get away because of the pressures of being a pastor. And so in his mind, my friend, in essence, he saw this, that he and his wife, because the monies came out of the proceeds for the poor, to fund the pastor's vacation, my friend saw this as him and his wife paying for the pastor to go to Disneyland with their kids. This story perfectly represents the plutocracy and the precariat. Here in the state of Utah, one story I hear from one friend that I know, one guy. Can you imagine what has happened over the culmination over the period of centuries in this? I mean, one story, all in the name of Jesus and the good news. That's all in the name of it. Everything that we're doing with this stuff, right? Another story. It's not so apparent, but it's subtly represents what I'm talking about. I write and study in the very same place almost every morning, and there's a pastor from a large local denomination who comes in there and for coffee, and he knows me from the show, and sometimes he'll say, "Good morning, Shawn," as he passes by. His congregation is taught to tithe and to bear this burden, this religious tax, so to speak, foisted upon all, including the poor. It's given out. So last Sunday, I was in this place preparing to teach and dressed like I normally dress. And the pastor walked in and he's dressed not like he usually. He's got the finest suit, finest tie, fine shirt. And I know fashion, believe it or not. I studied it. And I heard him tell the cashier, his face was tan, that he just returned from a tropical vacation with his family. How wonderful it was, right? So I sidled up to him and put my arm around his shoulder, and I said to the cashier, who knows us both, "Can you believe that the two of us here, it's hard to believe we're both in the same business, isn't it?" And he grimaced and he pulled away from me. He knew exactly what I was saying to him. He knew the point. See, in Chomsky's analysis of the secular world, taxes and the shifting of tax burden plays no less of a role than tithes do in the church. The burden is shifted not just upon the masses in the church. Listen, the burden is truly upon the poor. When a church preaches tithe, the burden is upon the poor. Let me explain why. There are two T's to consider in the shifting of burden in the church: taxes, tax breaks and tax benefits, and tithing. Those two T's. And the churches have shifted the onus from the church and the powers that lead the church, should be Jesus, to the people. Let's talk about taxes. Who pays taxes? Well, people who have enough money and make enough money pay taxes. The tax law says that people who donate to a church can write their donations off from their taxes. And so people of means, people who make money, donate to the church and get the benefit of deducting it from their income taxes. Do the poor get to write off donations every year? Typically not, because they don't make enough money. So there's no need for the write-off. So this tax loophole in the churches benefits the affluent or those who have, but it does nothing for those who don't. All right, stay with me. But this isn't the only factor working against the poor in the churches, which is antithetical to the gospel message, and it's antithetical to the Old Testament message of God wanting the poor taken care of. Tithes really plays the role. See, tithes in the church are heaped upon everybody from the pulpit. Let's have a donation, your tithes. There's a lesson at the beginning of every year, usually in January, about the importance of tithes. Some pastors will spend 1/12 of the year, all the month of January, talking about the importance of tithes. And they'll talk about that. Everyone has to pay it, but the rich or the wealthy get to write their tithes off, right? And so there's a benefit to them. But the poor, who typically have no application for write-off, are expected to pay tithes without any benefit being passed on to them. So again, the poor get screwed. Now, I understand all the promises with tithing from a spiritual place and everything. God's going to bless you, tithe or not. He knows what he's doing. And that Old Testament thing about if you pay, you won't be burned at his second coming is done. It's done with. Okay? We're supposed to be cheerful givers. If you want to give, poor or rich, you do it that way. But the tithe. So in any case, the burden has been shifted to the poorest of the poor in the name of God. The co-shepherds of the flock are the ones pushing payment upon all. They use the widow's mite as an example of why the poor should pay. That's the furthest thing from Jesus' mind, in my opinion, of what he was saying there. So the final shift of the burden by the top 1% to the masses comes by way of ministerial perks. Family vacations, life insurance packages, benefits that aren't accessible to most people, for the pastors, that are provided by a direct preaching of having to pay tithes to be right with God. And they illustrate nothing but a plutocratic, precariat relationship right here in the faith. Jesus had John and James' mother come to him, and she said, you know, in your kingdom, can Johnny and Jimmy here sit on your right and left side? And Jesus said, yeah, I can't give that to you. And the apostles got really ticked, it says. And so then Jesus talks to the disciples, and he says, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. That's the corporate world. That's the government world. That's the top 1% that Chomsky talks about. He says the princes of the Gentiles, they exercise dominion over them, right? But listen to what he says about those who follow him. But it shall not be so among you. Not. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even so the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto. I didn't come to be at the top 1%, but to minister and to give my life as a ransom for many. Pastors who follow in Christ's name as his co-shepherds among the flock ought to be doing the same thing. Now, in the spirit of transparency, I have to admit my own guilt in this. I want to be transparent on everything, and my own culpability in the area of personal benefits. I am personally grateful for the tax-exempt status that campus has because it's a church. Because without it, the people with means would never pay a cent to the ministry because they wouldn't be able to write it off. And they would give it to another place that they would be able to write it off to. That's just the way the world works. I'm able to justify this status in campus because we don't preach tithing. In fact, we stand against it. We don't take collections or gather donations for campus. So the way I see it is, it's there. If you want to write it off, you can. We'll provide it to you, but we're not preaching tithing to you. I have to admit, I feel like a coward when I haven't been able to yet say, screw your tax write-off rule. We don't want it. And we don't preach politically. We don't even touch political items, which is the whole reason why there's a write-off for churches. That's the only justification I have, is we don't talk about political things, whether there's a write-off or not. So I kind of, have a pretext to my justification. Also, I personally benefit from a tax loophole. And that is, I receive part of my monthly income in the form of a housing allowance, which the IRS allows pastors to receive. Again, I feel kind of cheesy about it. That's not available to the people who are not pastors. Some reason I get to get $500 a month. No, excuse me. I get to get $24,000 a year written off. I mean, not written off, reported, but not taxable because I'm a pastor. $24,000 a year. Other people don't get that. I take advantage of it. So I earned $27,000 in income last year, and I earned $27,000. Well, I earned a total of about $47,000. That's with the housing allowance and the income, right? 20 of it or 27,000 of it was not taxable. I have to live with that. Very blessed to get what I receive by way of this income. But I think that in terms of what Paul says about pastors being able to live, I think the amount of money that I make is commensurate with the amount that the ministry gives away and the amount of work I do. And I do work for my hire, and there it is, transparent. I don't think this can be said when churches are preaching tithing and they are raking in millions and they're building empires and edifices and the pastors are benefiting like no other. That, to me, I feel like I'm on the border of the deal. And I guess I am playing a bit of a border, but it's the best I can do without totally destroying the ministry financially, because some of our bigger contributors, they need a write-off, and so that's why they give. Getting back to Chomsky's fourth principle applied to the church, Jesus, the founder of our faith, took a hit personally to save and reach the world. The burden was shared by his apostles. If we're in the employ of doing the same thing that he has set up to do, I think it should be similar. There should be a loss, a hit taken, not more benefits than what the people in the churches presently have. In the fallen secular world, the few will not give way to the many. They will always seek their own. They take. When this becomes the condition in the church is nothing more than an extension of the world. It becomes an extension of the Gentiles, like Jesus talked about. I don't think that's what he had in mind. I really don't. And it's existed for 2,000, close to 2,000 years.